Hello everybody and welcome to the Rocket Lasso Gemstone Collection video. I wanted to sort of archive this with a video in the same way that I've done with the Rocket Lasso plugins, just so that you know exactly what's included in the zip, what you're getting into if you were to purchase this and put it together. So that's what this is. First thing to mention is this is available for purchase via our Gumroad page, but if you are supporting on Patreon at the $10 level or above, you will get a 100% off coupon to get this. Just throwing that out there. Support is always appreciated, and I want to be able to give back to the people who are supporting us, so that was the goal behind that. First of all, inside the zip, you will find this folder here. So what do we got? We've got just some different details, just like the plugins. Here's a link to this current video if you ever need to check it out again. But inside of the Gemstone folder, you will find 4 different files. I have an Alembic file and an OBJ, just in case you are in some other different software package. I didn't want to limit it. And then we've got 2 different C4D files. So opening up this first one, you will see that I've got a bunch of different models all on top of each other. The reason for that is they're just ready to copy and paste, move into any file, do what you want. These are at real world scale. You'll see as I select all of them and go to the coordinates, I can type in, let's say, num times 4, and now every single one of them will offset as compared to the previous one. You'll see that each one is pivoting exactly from the bottom, each of those set up perfectly there. Some of these are based off of real world gemstones, so they are scaled appropriately. And I've been kind of saying there are 10. There's actually 13 here, but some of them are so simple like that and that and that. I don't really include them in the count, but the rest of them took quite some time to put together. Something to mention is if you are supporting on Patreon, then you might want to check out the different list of videos that's going to be included in one of the Patreon posts, where I actually created these via 12 different episodes. So it's like 12 episodes times 2 or 3 hours each. So it took a while to put these together. But all these lined up, ready to go. You'll see if I go into these materials, and I'm going to paste in this checkerboard I happen to have copied. I can apply that to all of these, and you'll see that these are all UV unwrapped and ready to be used that way. I just tried to make this as user-friendly as possible. Hitting undo, I don't need that. If you want to put this into your assets browser, let's begin by selecting all of those. And here in R25, I'll click Reset Transform, and they all zero out again. Moving into the assets browser, I will allow that to load. Move into the objects folder, for me will be best. I already have created a Rocket Lasso folder. By right-clicking on the word Rocket Lasso, I can, actually that's already there, I'll delete this. And then right-clicking Rocket Lasso, I'll say create category. I would like to make a gemstones category. Say okay, it makes a new folder. Going inside that folder, I can just select all of these different gemstones, drag them in, and say okay, don't even change anything. And all of those will populate as their own standalone model, ready to be dragged into any scene file that you happen to be working in, ready to go. If you want to get fancy, we could always, let's see, how do we see the details? I'm going to right click and say show details. And I could go to keywords and add a keyword. So I could say gemstone, hit enter, and it creates that as something searchable. So at any given point, I can now be in any folder, go to new content. I can say, you know what, I actually want my gemstone. And it should automatically find those no matter where they are. And now they've popped up because we labeled them. So just throwing that out there as a handy way of using the assets browser if you're in one of the newer versions of Cinema. Closing the assets browser, let's move into the next scene file. Now, this is all about the models, these gemstone models, but as a bonus, I did create a bunch of Redshift materials. I did Redshift because Redshift is the one that's most closely associated with Maxon, and it's the one I'm most familiar with, although I'm not an expert. So dragging that file over, it should pop open. Moving on into it, you can see that this scene file is set up more for demo purposes. So all the gemstones are laid out. They're perfectly on the ground. I've got a bunch of custom lighting that I put in here with a bunch of different Redshift lights. And there's a camera with the text on there, so you can always clean that up. There's also this notes null that I can click on. You can see a couple different notes about it. So let's go and talk about some additional features that come along with this scene file. The main thing being it is all set up and ready to render. So opening up the Redshift render view. I can hit go on that, and immediately these should begin to render. There's a lot going on here, lots of reflection and refraction and caustics. That you won't see caustics unless you turn on the bucket rendering. But you can see how we've got these gemstones and they're ready to go. They don't render instantaneously, but I think they're looking pretty nice. I will turn off, let me hit Controller Command B, open up the render settings. I'm going to turn off my Redshift post effects to turn off these glows and whatnot. It's going to make it harder to demo if those are turned on. So with that off, you can now see our different gemstones, and they are ready to go. That goes along with these. I'm going to twirl down my material manager, and you can see I've got a whole series of materials that come along here. A couple you can ignore, like the softbox and like the text. colors, but we've got a bunch of different gemstones here. We've got the diamond, so there's things like rose quartz and sapphire, ruby, emerald, a bunch of like the go-to ones, I think. And what do we got? We got 12 different ones of those, but then I've got a 13th, and this is what we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about, and that is the gem maker material. So all of these are really straightforward. Sapphire, double clicking on that, I can drag it over. You can see that there's no extra nodes. It's just the Redshift material with like some index of refraction typed in and some of the proper colors piped in the correct spots. But if I select the gem maker material, you can see it's a lot more complicated. And this green node up here is an external user data setup so that you never have to go into this material if you don't want to. Closing that, you'll see if I select the gem maker, we can go to the gem maker tab, and we're going to get all of the settings ready for you to change the material without needing to go into the material. Let's apply this. I'll do that by selecting all of the different gemstones, right clicking on it and say apply. You can see it's applied on top of it, and that will completely override anything that comes before, so we don't need to worry about these. Before I forget, one thing to note is each of these does have a bevel applied to it, and it's a very tiny 0.01 bevel just to get these corners a little bit rounded, just catch that little extra glint of light. Anyway, let's get back to the material. You'll see immediately these all turned blue, and that's because if I select the material maker, that the color is currently set to blue. Selecting that, let's go and make it kind of a teal color. Bright teal. And as soon as I do, the color changes to that. Let's make it a orange color. And it changes to that. Let's make it bright white for sort of a default kind of diamond-esque material. Super blown out and looks great. Move this down to nearly black. And these will get really dark and opaque. So just by changing the color, you can see how much that is affecting this overall material. I did a lot of work trying to link all these things up in logical ways. Now, let's say you just want that a little bit cloudy. You could always pull this up and just add a little bit of gray. And you can see through it now, but it's not all the way. Let's pull this to, let's give it like a bit of a color, not too much. And we'll pull back pretty dark on there. And then you can see it's pretty dark, but you get those hints of purple sneaking through. So just by changing the color, you can see how many things you open up here. Now, things get a little bit more fun. You'll see in the viewport that all these different models have a different color. And that's because if you select any one of them, there is a custom display color turned on, and I put a different color on every single one of those. Inside of this material, selecting it again, you'll see there is a checkbox called Override with Display Color. If I turn that on, it is no longer seeing this color anymore. It is seeing their individual custom color. So it's a way of having one material and applying it in a bunch of different ways. I think that's pretty fun. I really like that. Now let's just walk through these parameters one by one. To see the hue variation, I'll temporarily turn off Override Display Color, and we'll go back to something simple like this. Let's go to something nice and bright. A nice bright pink will work just fine. So nice bright pink. Now, if I grab the hue variation and crank that all the way up, we're going to start to see some different colors sneaking in. You see a little bit of red sneaking in and some blue sneaking in. So it's just kind of doing a little variation on top of that. I think we'll see it even better if I make that a little bit darker, which will make it a little bit more opaque. And yeah, you see these darker areas and these lighter areas. Now, 100% goes decently far. You can see there's definitely some variation on there. But some of these parameters are not clamped, meaning I can push it beyond 100%. So if I drag that up a whole bunch, you're going to start seeing even more color variation on top of it. So let's push it even further. You're going to start seeing an entire rainbow of colors on top of it. Now, we could, right now it's laid out randomly, and right now there's some red here and some green here. If we change the random seed, then that will completely randomize and everything will be placed somewhere completely different. Those are based on different noises. So that is some hue variation. Pulling back on that, let's turn back on our override display color. So we see all the different colors. And we can do some value variation. We're not going to see too much here. Let's crank that up all the way. And you'll see that these will start, first of all, getting desaturated, but that's because it's adding in a lot of black and a lot of white. So you'll get some darker areas and some lighter areas within the material. You'll see that a lot better once I'll zero that out, once we add in a bunch of cloudiness. Now I'm going to, first of all, just crank it up all the way, and you're going to see that these become really, really opaque. They become very cloudy. Now they don't have to be fully cloudy, and technically there is still some light passing through them. But if we pull back on this, you can see that they're only a little bit cloudy, and we can find any point in between. Now that we've got lots of cloudiness, I will crank this value variation up a lot, and you'll be able to just see it a lot more clearly here, where things are going to be dark and light on top of it. And then we could add some hue variation on top of that. Typically, I go easy on the value variation, just get a little bit, and then the hue variation, you see the orange sneaking in here on top of the red, things like that. Okay, so that's cloudiness. I'll pull back on those two. We'll step through these nice and simple. Instead of cloudiness, we'll do blur. And once again, let's not be subtle. I'll crank the blur up all the way, and we're going to be getting a very blurred transparency. They start feeling a lot more like candy. Typically, I don't go too far with this setting. We just add a little bit, and you see how messed up the internals start looking. And what I think starts looking really nice is a little bit of cloudiness and a decent amount of blur. And like these start looking delicious, like you could eat them. Now, of course, everything combines in all sorts of ways on top of each other, not least of all moving on to our imperfections. So pulling back in the cloudiness and blur, let's just look at imperfections. We'll crank it up all the way. And what do we see? Well, it's going to just sort of mess them up a little bit. Now, it's messing them up in several different ways. It's actually taking the refraction and slightly changing the way it looks on different parts of the surface, but it also adds some bump onto the surface. Now, if you don't want any bump, you can see right here that they're tabbed over a little bit. So bump and noise scale are sort of subservient to the imperfections. But if I say, hey, bump, let's go completely away, you're going to see that even with no bump, that there's still imperfections happening inside of that via kind of how transparent they are and the different levels of refraction inside of them. So just a little bit of messing them up. Now we can always crank up the bump all the way, or I think that can go beyond. Yeah, we can go nuts, but let's just do 100%. And you see this will really mess up the surface here. Now, these are cut gemstones, so obviously their surfaces probably wouldn't be very messed up, but if you were to put this on some sort of like raw uncut gem, that could be pretty handy. Now, on top of that, we've also got our noise scale, and the noise scale will actually affect every noise in here. Well, let me just step through and show you. So if I were to crank up this hue variation, I'll go really high so we can see it pretty blatantly. You can see that we've got, everything from even going from green to yellow to orange to red. If we wanted that to be larger or smaller, we can do that via the noise scale. So let's say that the noise scale should go pretty small. Let's cut it in half. And immediately you're going to see the noise patterns show up even more. Like over here, you can see it really clearly. We get like smaller patches of red before it moves to yellow to green. Just everything is smaller. The bump also gets smaller and the imperfections get smaller. The value variation would also get smaller. But of course, we move the opposite direction. Let's make it double the original scale. And now everything will be a little bit more chilled out. You can see that these are smoother transitions between them, but still there. And of course, that works on top of the random seed. So changing the random seed, completely different layout, completely different random hue variation. It's cranked up so much, yeah, I would expect a lot of variation to show up. So look at how much power there is just combining all of those. Getting rid of the bump, as I said, the surfaces you would think would still be smooth. We've now got a lot of hue variation. Let's do a little value variation. I like making these maybe a little bit cloudy, add a decent amount of blur, and we have to let the renderer let these clean up a little bit, but you'll see how many combinations we can do just playing around with these sliders, not needing to go inside the material at all. I had a lot of fun putting this together. As I said, I'm not a Redshift expert. If anybody has any things that we need to add or changes that they'd like to see, that's why I named this version 1. If somebody gives me a heads up on something cool to do with it, I can always update this and add additional options or clean it up and make little tweaks. So version 1 of the gem material. So I think those are looking pretty cool. Couple extra things I'd like to talk about. First of all, I have all these different renders, and I made all of these different renders using these materials. So let me just pop that open and tab through them really quickly. You can see there's a bunch of cloudiness there, and here they're very opaque, kind of a solid color with a little hue variation. This is just messing them up with some value. And then let's go here, just some nice kind of ruby looking ones. Here's some almost like radioactive looking ones. A little opaque, a very dark material. And yeah, just having fun layering them up. Now we're getting to that in just a moment. And this and this. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Moving back into the scene file, I would like to get some internal structure going on these. And what's the best way to do that? Well, let's simplify. First of all, let's get rid of pretty much every setting. We'll go back to something nice and basic. And actually, let's get rid of the... We'll do that in a moment. Back to super basic, super clean, crisp gemstones. Now, I will go into our MoGraph menu and create a Voronoi fracture and drop all of the gemstones inside of it. The instant that I do, it's going to, first of all, take on the color of the Voronoi fracture. And you probably know when you break something apart. Let me show you. Each piece gets its own unique color assigned, and that is happening via the colorize fragments. So you could, of course, turn that off, and now they just become a solid color. In this case, it'll just pretty much turn white. But this would probably be a good chance to go into the gem maker and say, hey, don't use the display color, although it would be cool. You could use MoGraph and you could colorize them in the Voronoi fracture via different fields and effectors. But let's just make that a nice solid color. And now let's break this apart a little bit more. Inside of sources, I would like a lot more pieces. I'm going to jump this up about 10. So we got 222 different pieces, and you see it breaking apart all over, and we can begin to see some internal structure on here. Now, you want to make sure your polygon walls aren't perfectly touching. Typically, renderers don't know what to do that. So under objects, I will put a tiny bit of spacing between them. So 0.01 is a good go-to, and you'll see it will change significantly. Give that, yeah, you see how different that is as soon as those walls are not perfectly bouncing against each other. So now we get all this internal structure going. And now, because those are broken apart, we get a lot of options for adding variation. For instance, let's add in, well, let's go to the gem maker and let's add in some of our hue variation. I'll crank that up because it's subtle. And a little bit of cloudiness and a decent amount of blur. We'll go easy on that, but a decent amount of imperfections with no bump. So that's going to mess that up quite a bit. But now you see those become solid. More solid, but look at all this awesome internal structure going. Now, of course, these take a little bit of time to resolve. The renderer has to calculate all these different layers of refraction and reflection, but this internal structure allows for it to catch light in a lot more interesting ways. So I have found it very fun to play around with these, adding variation, just tinkering around overall. And back to these renders, you can see where when this resolves, that we still have a tiny bit of the caustics casting through. And these just have so much fun internal structure. Opening up the render settings, I would like to turn on the post effects again. You'll see that'll just brighten those up a little bit. And let's do a full-on bucket render. Probably look even better if we let this be pretty... I want it to be more transparent so we can get some more in the way of maybe some caustics. So I'll turn on the bucket rendering. That'll take a little bit, so I'll do a cut here. That took about 2 minutes to render. You see that we get all these nice internal structures. So that wraps this up. Thank you so much for checking it out and for supporting Rocket Lasso. Also, if you end up creating any cool renders using these gemstones or materials, I'd love to see the end result. I love seeing projects and renders put together using stuff that we created over here at Rocket Lasso because it's our job to empower you and unlock more of your creativity. So that'll wrap this up. Thank you so much, everybody, and I'll see you next time in a tutorial, a live stream, or maybe another product launch. Who knows? Bye-bye, everybody.